Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next game is R-Type. Wow, not too long after Gradius, Nintendo got involved with another iconic shoot-'em-up franchise. Now, unlike Gradius, this wasn't one that Nintendo published a port of or anything. While R-Type was developed and published by Irem in Japan, Nintendo of America was the one to distribute the game in the US, and they pretty clearly were the ones advertising it too. The videos for Gradius and R-Type ended up being pretty close to one another, but keep in mind that the versions of Gradius that I looked at were ports of a port of the arcade game, so there was actually a 2-year gap between the two original arcade machines. In fact, it was Gradius that inspired Irem to make a shoot-'em-up to begin with. Apparently, their main artist, Akio, was even a pretty big fan of Gradius, and they made very conscious decisions on what they could do to differentiate their game from Gradius. When brainstorming how to create a unique power-up system, they came up with the Force Unit. Humorously, the idea first came to the designers as a joke. According to one of the designers, the inspiration actually came from a dung beetle. The idea was that what if the thing you powered up wasn't the character itself, but some other object the character moved around? Despite starting off as a joke, they expanded on the idea and ended up building most of the upgrade system around it. The name of R-Type itself comes from the word ray, since many of the attacks are lasers in this game. R-Type ended up being a pretty big hit in Japan, and it was reportedly the highest-grossing arcade game of 1987. Now, as a quick refresher, at this point Nintendo had pulled out of the arcade market in Japan, and their arcade presence in the West was on life support. The only machine Nintendo really was focusing on was the Play Choice 10, which was essentially just an NES that brought their home console games to the arcades. However, despite their dwindling presence, Nintendo of America for some reason decided to work with Irem on the US release of R-Type. I'm not entirely sure how this deal came to be, but keep in mind this wasn't Nintendo's first time working with Irem. Irem was the original creator of Kung Fu Master and 10-Yard Fight, which both received NES ports that Nintendo got involved with in some form. Despite the game's success, it doesn't look like this was really enough for Nintendo of America to keep publishing third-party arcade machines overseas like this. Setting aside the individual versus system and Play Choice 10 games, Nintendo's only actual machine left after this was the Nintendo Super System, a continuation of the ideas behind the Play Choice 10, and even that fizzled out pretty quickly. Since they weren't the original creators, I can't really say this was Nintendo's last arcade original, but it does give us an interesting glimpse into the final days of Nintendo's arcade presence. Alright, with that out of the way, let's jump into my time with the game. The arcade flyer sort of explains the story, but it's pretty minimal. You pilot the R9 interstellar spacecraft, and your mission is to defeat the evil Bido Empire, who have held the cosmos in fear and relentless suffering. Upon starting the game, you are immediately thrown into the action. The first level starts off with a pretty standard space section with enemies flying around and dudes walking along the ground. You've got a standard attack, and you can hold down the fire button to charge your shot. I couldn't find anything concrete on this, but I think this was one of the first games to feature a charge shot. Eventually, I entered some kind of ship or starbase, where I found one of these spherical guys, which are what dropped the power-ups in this game. The power-up I grabbed here made the Force Unit that I mentioned before fly in. This thing is pretty interesting. You can attach it to either the front or the back of your ship, and when you do this, you'll get a pretty massive boost to your defense on that side. The Force Unit absorbs shots, and it even damages whatever enemies it touches. Later on, you can also upgrade the Force Unit to have stronger attacks, but for now, it doesn't do much else while it is attached to your ship. However, at any point, you can also choose to launch the Force Unit forward or backwards, depending on where it is attached. Not only will this damage whatever it touches, but it will also shoot out attacks whenever you do while it is out like this. You can reattach it back to yourself by touching it again. While this can be useful in certain situations as an attacking method, it's also required if you want to switch which side of the ship the Force Unit is attached to. While most power-ups in the game revolve around the Force Unit, not all of them do. Sometimes the spherical enemies will drop other kinds of power-ups too. The S power-up increases your speed, the M power-up gives you a new missile attack that homes in on your opponents, and the rare bit power-ups will act as an added shield. While I was playing around with these power-ups, I blew up a few times and got a game over already. Similar to Gradius, getting hit once will cause you to immediately lose a life. On the next run, I finally got another Force power-up, upgrading the Force Unit to level 2. The second upgrade will give the Force Unit a new attack, and what specific attack you get depends on which of the 3 upgrade types you've collected. Here, I grabbed the blue upgrade, which is the reflection laser. This causes the Force Unit to shoot out 3 different lasers that reflect and bounce off of surfaces. Deeper in, I found another blue power-up, which upgraded the Force unit to the final level. This is basically a beefed-up version of the level 2 unit. The Force unit itself gets even bigger, and the beams it shoots out become even stronger too. Eventually, I ran into the first boss. This big, nasty alien-looking dude is apparently called Dopkeratops, and it's used quite a bit in the marketing for this game. Looking at that Japanese flyer though, it almost looks more like a different alien creature than this thing. Anyway, during our first encounter, I mashed away and tried to dodge the various attacks he threw at me. However, he started scooting closer and closer to me, and eventually I tried to see if I could move to a different position, but I got destroyed by his tail. Next time, since I didn't have nearly as many power-ups, I decided to just focus on using charge shots instead. After hitting his weak point only a few times, he went down super quickly. I guess the charge shot is pretty strong against bosses. For the next stage, I was taken to this gnarly-looking level with mounds of aliens on the top and bottom. Sometimes, an alien even emerges and flies at you. Eventually, I ran into this giant worm thing that flew around the stage too. After some time, it flew into this giant fleshy mound and the boss music started playing. I guess that worm was part of the boss the whole time. For this fight, you've got to occasionally hit its weak spot that opens up in the middle while dodging the worm thing that keeps going in and out of the boss. The tricky thing about this boss is that it's a little cramped, but thankfully I was able to keep my wits about me and I beat it on my first try. On to level 3. The next level is an interesting stage that basically just has you facing off against a massive ship for the entirety of it. Right at the start, I grabbed a yellow upgrade which gave me a new type of move. This one shoots up and down, then travels along the surface. It can be useful in some situations, but generally I liked the laser power-up better. Man, this stage was pretty chaotic sometimes, and I got hit by something in the midst of the chaos. I guess the Force unit doesn't protect you from all kinds of shots. As you go on in this level, you can destroy various parts of the ship to stop the attacks. However, I was having a hard time getting very far into the level, and I pretty quickly got another game over. This time, I paid more attention to the game over screen, which gives you 9 seconds to put in your quarters and continue. Man, the song it plays here is so dramatic. Sadly, I couldn't figure out which button I had configured to start the game up again, and I ran out of time by mistake. Whoops, I guess it's back to the start for me. On my next run, I finally got to see the third power-up type. This thing probably has an official name, but I just called it the DNA weapon, as it fires 2 strands of lasers that spin around each other. I like this one quite a bit too. It was really good at clearing out the enemies in front of you. I ended up getting through levels 1 and 2 with ease, although I got blasted pretty quickly on stage 3 again. Darn, there goes all my power-ups. I eventually got pretty deep into the level, but when trying to swap the Force onto the back of my ship, I accidentally missed it and it got stuck on the bottom of the stage. Since I had no way to attack behind me without it, this was pretty much a death sentence. This caused me to get another game over, but thankfully, this game lets you continue as much as you want, assuming you actually know how to push the start button. After a while, I finally reached the boss, which was this weird piston thing that connected to the ship that occasionally opened up and exposed its weak spot. The location of it here is pretty awkward, but since the Force unit is so good at both attacking and defending, I was eventually able to take him out. On to level 4. This was the first stage I really started to struggle on. There's these green circle things all over the level that you have to destroy, and these red dudes fly around that keep making more of the green stuff. This level just got so chaotic at times, and sometimes the bad guys would fly in out of nowhere and mess me up. While overall I like how complex a lot of the stages are, you kind of need to memorize them if you want to do well. Something I learned in this level is that not only does each stage have checkpoints, but continuing after a game over even preserves your checkpoints. Now, you may think that's actually a good thing, but it has a serious downside that we'll see later on. There's this section near the end that's covered in these green circles, and here I found out you can pretty easily use the Force unit to destroy the green stuff. After this section is the boss. This guy is this big red thing that can split into 3 and fly around all over the place. It's also shooting you constantly, and you can only hit the glowing green weak spots. Man, I struggled a lot on this guy. It's just hard to weave around him while he's also shooting at you. The stage itself was pretty rough too, and I got game over after game over on this one. Finally though, after almost 30 minutes on it, I beat it. My final strat on the boss involved a lot of swapping the Force unit from front to back to try and protect myself as much as possible. Up next was stage 5. I was in something again for this one, and we joked that it looked like I was inside a cave of Q-tips. This stage has these big green things that slowly fly through the stage and shoot lasers at you. They were pretty tough to destroy without any upgrades, so once I lost my first life here, things got kind of rough. It also throws these centipede things at you, and they can break into a bunch of small pieces depending on where you shoot them. After some time, I reached the boss, which was this big mechanical core surrounded by a bunch of gray blobs, each with their own health. I died a few times to him, but I found out something kind of silly that helped a bunch. I thought you needed to avoid the Q-tips on the top and bottom, but they were actually completely safe to move through. This gave me the space I needed, and I eventually took him out. After this was Stage 6, which saw another sizable spike in difficulty. You're in some kind of mechanical structure now, and the big thing that makes this one tough is that there's these massive yellow ships that fly around the level, and you can't really tell which way they are going unless you have their patterns memorized. You can destroy them, but you can only hit one side of them, which wasn't always reachable. This one required a lot of memorization. Honestly, for me, this one probably required the most memorization out of any stage in the game. Also, the music for this was way too upbeat for how brutal it was. But hey, at least it's pretty catchy. The really nasty part was the checkpoint. Every time you die, you get taken back to a point where like a million of these walker guys spawn in and shoot a barrage of missiles at you. You don't have any power-ups when you first spawn in, so you can't use the force unit to protect you at all here. This was the first case of me really feeling the downside of game over starting you at the checkpoint. Deep into levels, it was often more difficult to get enough power-ups to survive. Frankly, I think this level would have been so much easier if the game just sent you back to the start of it on game overs. I just died so much to these guys over and over and over again, and they would have been significantly easier if I just had a single force upgrade. The later part of this level required quite a bit of memorization too, so combine that with the brutal checkpoint and it took me a while to reach the boss. Speaking of, the boss of this level was just a chamber that sent tons of those big ships at you. You basically just got to survive long enough, although you can destroy the ships to make it easier too. It still took me a few tries, but eventually I survived long enough and beat the stage. Oh boy, here we go, level 7. Despite not being the final level, this one wrecked me. This level is just so chaotic. There's enemies flying around everywhere and everything is shooting bullets at you too. Another tough aspect is that random parts of the walls will just explode, and these can really catch you off guard if you don't know when they happen. It took me forever, but eventually I made it to the checkpoint. However, this is where things really took a bad turn. The rest of this stage isn't all that long, but without any power-ups, this section was ridiculous. There's just guys everywhere, and without the force upgrade, there's not much you can do to keep them under control. There is a power-up here, but unfortunately, it's just a speed upgrade. It took me forever, but I started to develop an exact strat on how to get through it. However, it ended up not mattering at all. The next section was even worse. A ton of enemies fly in and you just get bombarded with projectiles. On the rare occasion I did make it to this section, I would just get overwhelmed by them and eventually get hit. In the previous level, I complained about how hard the checkpoints made the stage, but this one is clearly worse. Even with just a single force power-up, I probably could have developed a strat that worked. It sounds kind of silly to say this, but I really wish game overs reset you back to the start of each level. After over an hour of failing on this again and again, I knew what needed to be done. I needed to reset the whole entire game and beat this section in one try. Maybe there was some strat that can get you through it, but I just wasn't able to find anything that worked. With much dismay, I made the call to start all over again. However, there was one problem with this. If I messed up even once at the later parts of this stage, including on the upcoming boss that I hadn't seen yet, I would have to start the entire game all over again. So I made another call. I decided to practice R-Type using save states. To be clear, for anyone who hasn't heard me talk about this yet, I try to avoid save states as much as possible, and if I do use them, I only use them for practicing. In the end, I will always do a complete run of a game without save states. It looks like R-Type gets to join the elite list of games that broke me down enough to make me use save states. I also decided to just practice the rest of the game since I didn't want to have to restart again, but I made sure I wouldn't see the ending until the real run. I was actually really close to the end of level 7. Just past the crazy bullet section was the boss, although this fight is pretty chaotic. There's garbage constantly falling from above during the fight, and occasionally a robot emerges from the garbage and shoots an attack at you from below. The actual boss doesn't do much. He occasionally pops up on the right with garbage in hand. I think he tosses the garbage at you eventually, but I usually just destroyed it as soon as he popped in. You can only hit the boss when he pops in like this, so most of the time I just focused on dodging all the garbage. While I was able to beat him relatively easily, I was still kind of concerned. One small slip up in a real run and it was back to the start of the entire game. However, after a couple of victories, I decided to see what I was in for on the final stage. The final level itself is pretty simple. You fly through one final corridor while it sends a bunch of these aliens at you that kind of look like babies. These things don't have a whole lot of life or anything, but there's just so many of them and they can appear out of nowhere and take you out in an instant. Eventually, this weird spiral thing shows up too, and it can't be destroyed. It just flies around and you have to avoid it. After a few tries, I ran into the final boss, the Bido Core. This thing kind of just looks like an old dude hiding behind a barrier. At first, you can't even hit him, and you've just got to focus on dodging the babies and that weird spiral thing. After some time passes, the barrier opens up momentarily and the core opens its mouth and shoots another spiral out. Whoa, that is not where I thought his mouth was. This brief window seems like the only time to hit him, and to make matters worse, the second spiral joins the first one in flying around the stage. This made the spot I was camping in no longer safe. Then, after he opens up again, he shot another spiral out. At this point, things were so hectic, and even with constant save states, I was struggling. How on earth was I going to beat this guy? Finally, after surviving long enough, the spirals just homed in on me and wiped me out. Okay, I was clearly missing something with this fight. After experimenting for a bit, I finally realized what you need to do. You have to shoot your force unit into the core when he opens up and leave it there while you dodge everything on the outside. However, this caused one major problem. Without the force unit, it was a lot harder to dodge the babies since you no longer had that massive piece of protection. I think this might be a lot easier if you managed to enter the level with 2 of those shield upgrades above and below you, but I knew it would be tough to count on beating this without dying, so I decided to try and learn the fight without the upgrades. Geez, between those spiral things and the babies flying from all directions, this boss was pretty insane. It's definitely up there with Super Macho Man as one of the toughest final bosses in the challenge so far. Once I finally confirmed it was possible with minimal upgrades, I decided I was done practicing him. However, I still wasn't quite comfortable yet. I was really worried about the boss of the previous stage. He's not as hard, but a single mess up would essentially mean I would need to start the whole game over because of that nasty checkpoint. After experimenting some more, I found out something super nice. There was a sweet spot I could just sit in that was completely safe from all the obstacles. The best part was that it lined up perfectly with the boss's weak point, so as long as I could line myself up properly, the boss would basically be free. With that strat figured out, it was time to finally attempt another complete run. At first, I actually did super good on the first few stages. I even finally got to see what it was like having 2 of those shields, only to get wrecked by a random guy from behind on the stage with all the green stuff. Darn. It still took a few game overs, but I finally made it back to stage 7. Okay, time to lock in. No mistakes. All that practicing paid off as I was able to do everything as planned. I got through the part with all the enemies with little sweat, and I was able to use that perfect lineup to beat the boss with ease. Yes, I finally got through it. At this point, I knew the final level wouldn't be easy, but there shouldn't be any need to go back to the start now. I had a shield at this point, so ideally I'd keep it for the boss since it would help a lot with the babies. However, those dreams were quickly crushed as I flew straight into one of them. Looks like this is going to be a minimal power-up run after all. Man, this boss is just so tough without the shield upgrades. I died quite a bit to the spirals and the babies out of nowhere. Finally though, after some super close calls, I did it. I survived the onslaught of attacks and took down the Bido Core, flinging my arms around in celebration like a goofball. The ending shows you flying alongside a bunch of other ships and tells you that peace has been restored to the cosmos. With that, R-Type was complete. On to the review. Oh boy, with playing this next to Gradius and giving a review of both of them, I feel like I might be stepping into a multi-decade long feud or something. However, when I compare the two, I personally like R-Type more than Gradius. Now, as I said on my video on Gradius, shoot-em-ups aren't entirely my favorite genre to begin with, so I wouldn't really call this one of my all-time favorites or anything, but I do think it's my favorite arcade original in the challenge so far. I think the main thing I like is that the stages feel a lot more interesting than in Gradius. Even if it did take a bit more memorization, ultimately I liked how much this game focused on navigating through a bunch of tough stages. I also like the bosses way more in this game too. Unlike Gradius, each boss is completely unique, and I found them to be a lot of fun to learn and conquer. Now, keep in mind, with all of these comparisons, R-Type was released a few years after Gradius, so there may be some technical limitations at play here. The Force upgrade is pretty cool too, and it adds a lot of depth to how you want to approach the obstacles in the game. While the upgrade selector in Gradius was kind of interesting, I think if I had to choose, I prefer the power-ups in R-Type more. Another praise I have for R-Type is the visuals. While I'm ultimately a gameplay first kind of guy, I personally think this is the best looking game in the challenge so far. The game is oozing with style, and the bosses in particular are super detailed. It's pretty clear that at this point, arcade machines had become more advanced than the NES. Oh, and the soundtrack is pretty good too. Now, about the difficulty. Overall, I really like how challenging the game is. Yeah, there's a decent amount of memorization, but since the checkpoints are pretty forgiving, I enjoyed learning the stages without feeling like I ever lost too much progress. However, this checkpoint system sort of falls apart a bit near the end. The fact that the checkpoints ultimately made level 6 and 7 harder was definitely annoying. I wish that either they made it so that the game overs took you back to the start of a stage, or that they just gave you a force unit power-up closer to the checkpoints on those two stages in particular. The fact that I basically needed to start the entire game over on level 7 simply due to a checkpoint was really frustrating. Even if there is a way to make it through the final part without enough power-ups, it was still so much harder than just starting the stage from the beginning, which just seems like an ineffective use of checkpoints. The game is still a lot of fun despite my issues with the checkpoints in the few final stages. I like the level of challenge, and the stages and bosses are really cool too. I gave the game an 8 out of 10. With R-Type complete, I have now finished 48 out of the 74 arcade games in the challenge, meaning I am now 64.86% of the way to all of the arcade games. If you are wondering where these remaining 26 arcade games are after what I said about Nintendo's arcade output at the beginning, basically I've decided to count everything on the Versus system and the Play Choice 10 as individual arcade games, even though they could easily be categorized as NES games too. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.